Welcome back today with my ranking of all the Pet Shop Boys albums, even including the new one Nonetheless, which was released today. I'm recording this on Friday, the 26th of April 2024. So we're going to rank 15 official studio albums by the Pet Shop Boys. No compilations, none of those remix albums they have plenty of. And I once did a ranking of not all Pet Shop Boys albums, but when the channel was still in its infancy, like 3 years ago or something like that, I made a video of my top 5 favorite Pet Shop Boys albums. And this was one of the worst videos technically, but also, in general. I think it's one of the most embarrassing videos on the channel. And the technical setup isn't that good also now, but back then it was really, it's even hard to understand what I'm talking about, because the microphone, for example, was such a cheap microphone, and the camera wasn't good. And even the ranking itself, a lot of things have changed for me. You will see a top 5, an album that was a top 5 album in my video 3 years ago is now at the bottom. And therefore we now should start, because at the bottom is the album Electric from 2013, I think. This was my number 5 album in my top 5 favorite Pet Shop Boys album ranking a couple of years ago. But now I have listened to all the albums in preparation for this video, and I'm not so fond of it anymore. There's still some tracks that I like Love is a Bourgeois Construct, for example, and Friday. I always thought that the rap part is a bit corny in it. That's the weakest part of the song, but the song Friday in general is quite a good later day Pet Shop Boys song. But I think the drop from number 5 to number 15 is because I think it's a bit of a superficial album, compared with the other work, especially with the albums they did before that. They released an album just 1 year before that, and 10 years ago I preferred this album. This is part 2, in a way, and I preferred this more upbeat part 2 much more. But these days I like the more mellow album more, but more on that album later. Next one is number 14. Maybe that's the first surprise to Pet Shop Boys fans, that this album is so low in the ranking. It's not from the imperial great success phase of the 80s, early 90s, but it's still in the, to many fans in that zone of where they could do no fault, basically. But I never really liked 1999's Nightlife. And one other thing, my preferred way of listening to the Pet Shop Boys are these multi-disc editions of the albums that they started putting out a couple of years ago. They're called Further Listening. So that's always the remastered original album plus bonus discs. In this case, there's even 2 more discs with bonus content. Usually it's just 1 bonus disc, but they have 2 or 3, where there's even 3 discs. So in this case, 2 discs of bonus material. Often it's just 1. Where you get lots of great B-sides. They have brilliant B-sides throughout their career, the Pet Shop Boys, but also songs they wrote for other artists. They also wrote lots of songs for other artists, great songs even, and remixes, of course. Often the radio edit, the single mixes of the singles is different to the album version. So my preferred way of listening to the Pet Shop Boys as a fan is the Further Listening sets. And this is the Further Listening set of Nightlife, but the core album, the real album Nightlife, it's a bit odd when I'm telling you this is the disco album, because to non-fans probably every Pet Shop Boys album is a disco album, but this is really where they went for the first time for really a disco nostalgia, back to the 70s Saturday Night Fever times. This is a bit of that, or there's even the single, I think it was the first single of the album, New York City Boy, which clearly is lifted from the Village People. Not the first time that they nicked something from the Village People, but it's not as good as Go West, which is also, Village People material. And other great songs, it's not for an album that tries to be an upbeat disco album. It's not that exciting to me. There are not many highlights. Sorry, the battery was empty. Had to recharge it. So now, like 3 hours later, I'm back. For you it's just 1 second later, but for me it's 3 hours later. But where was I? Number 14. It was number 14, Nightlife from 1999. So I think up until now I've talked quite negatively about that album. Now the positive, my favorite song is maybe one of the most atypical songs of this album. I think the weakness of that album to me is that it tries to be a very euphoric neo-disco kind of album, but sounds a bit tired. Most of those up-tempo songs on the album we've heard better on previous Pet Shop Boys albums. But I think the strongest track, in my opinion, is one of the ballads with Kylie Minogue, In Denial. That's quite a touching, moving song. It's from the perspective, and that's kind of typically clever Pet Shop Boys idea, Neil Tennant idea. It switches roles in a way, because I think it's about a father who admits to his daughter, which is Kylie Minogue in that song. She plays that character, the daughter. But the father, Neil Tennant, admits to his daughter that he's gay. I think the usual, the obvious way to do a song like that would be the other way around. That the child tells the parents that she's gay, or that he's gay. But it's the other way around, and that makes it interesting. Yeah, it's a very moving track. In Denial, great song. But that's one of the few songs I really like on that album. Number 13 is the kind of volume 1 to my number 15, Electric. Electric was from 2013. This is 2012's Elysium. Both albums had been recorded around the same time, but the Pet Shop Boys, I shouldn't say the Pet Shop Boys, hardcore fans would say it should always be just Pet Shop Boys without the. But, I hope you don't mind if, out of habits of calling bands the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, that I'm sometimes going to call them the Pet Shop Boys. But Pet Shop Boys, recorded Elysium and Electric around the same time. And then the boys decided that the more mellow stuff, the more reflective, introspective, no pun intended, stuff should be on this album, and the more up-tempo stuff should be on Electric. And as I said in the beginning of the video, previously, like a couple of years ago, and when they came out, I preferred Electric, because it's much more easier to get into those up-tempo bangers. But this has maybe a bit more depth, and therefore these days I prefer Elysium slightly to it. Number 13, 14, 15, these albums, I think they're all good. I don't think there's such a thing as a really bad Pet Shop Boys album. They're all good. This is slightly better than the previous two. Number 12. Now this is a bit of a step up now. I think 13, 14, 15 I would say are average to good albums. This is finally, I would say, a very good album, and it's Yes from 2009. What can I tell you about that album? Very eclectic, very entertaining. The highlight for me is Did You See Me Coming? It's a great song that could be from the golden Pet Shop Boys era. All in all, the album is not that memorable, so it's just my number 12. Number 11 is, up until today, the most recent, but today nonetheless was released. So Hotspot from, I think, 2020. I have to look it up. Yeah, 2020. Hotspot is my number. I always have to look there for the placements. It's my number 11. It's a good album, I would say. It gets off to a good start with the opener Will-O the Wisp. and it never really loses that momentum, and I think each track really complements the next or the previous track, and this is a very good listening experience. Maybe it's a bit lacking in real highlights to me. And now number 10 is the album that was released today, Nonetheless. Yeah, it's a great album, to be a top 10 Pet Shop Boys albums in my ranking means it's excellent, I think my number 15, 14, 13 are the albums that I'm not really too keen of, not too hyped about. 12, 11 is where I really like the albums, and so, now number 10, it's really a very good album nonetheless, the new album. I think it's maybe a bit like a throwback to Behavior, the concept of the album maybe, like Behavior, a very nostalgic album, an introspective album, not like the album Introspective, but very reflective songs, nostalgic songs, songs about maturing, about growing up, or in this case, one has to say growing old, and it has a brilliant sound, these days albums, especially also by legacy artists, if you're listening to new albums by the Rolling Stones or something like that, the production is really strange on new albums these days, but this album is really, there's really a great production by James Ford, who produced it and did a great job. These days albums, like I said, the new Rolling Stones album, for example, it often sounds so stale and sterile, and it doesn't really fit with what the band is about. But this is really an album that I think has for Pet Shop Boys, a kind of a timeless sound. I think this is an album, if you think it sounds good now, you will also think in 10 years that it sounds good. Maybe because there's lots of strings and big arrangements on that album. But also lots of real instrumentation, guitars, pianos, drums even. So it's really sounding rich and great. And yeah, it's a great album, and it's the right album, I think, at this stage in their career. The melodies are great. The title track, which was released maybe 3 months ago, is a great song. If they had released it like 25 years ago, maybe it would be a Pet Shop Boys classic by now. I think now they're at a stage in their career where they don't really have, no matter how good the song is, they're past the days where they really had classics, song classics, but this released in 1995, this could be a classic now. Nonetheless, it's a great track. It's a great song, but it's by far not my favorite song on the album. Other great songs is the very Beatly sounding New Bohemia. It sounds a bit like Now and Then by the Beatles, but better. It's a better song than Now and Then by the Beatles. Great song is Why Am I Dancing? Very euphoric. Like I said, many songs on that album are very, like the Behavior album, very serious and reflective. But this is a great song if you're more into the disco vibe of the Pet Shop Boys. So this album has it all. New London Boys, like West End Girls Part 2. It's about Neil's and also Chris' love for glam rock. Even David Bowie and Roxy Music get name checked in the song. So it's great single songs on that album, but also a great album, and I think this has the potential to be a grower album. So it's now number 10 because I'm a bit cautious when an album it just came out today, and it's always easy to get on the hype train, because these days with legacy artists, if they put out a new album, no matter if it's good or not good, all the media say, "Whoa, it's the best album since this or that." So I don't want to jump on that hype bandwagon too much. So that I think number 10 is really a very objective way to put it now. But I can see this really climbing a few steps in the future. And yeah, that's a great achievement at this stage in their career. Neil Tennant is now 70. I think Chris Lowe is 65 or something like that. So maybe they're the first electronic group ever that we grew old with, in a way, maybe apart from Kraftwerk. So yeah, great late day album by the Pet Shop Boys. Now we've had Nonetheless, the new album. Now we go back into the past with my number 9. And number 9 is, in my opinion, the best, the very best of the, I wouldn't say more recent albums, but of the albums from the past 10 years. It's Super. Super, I think, is slightly better to me than Nonetheless. But as I said in my Nonetheless review, I think Nonetheless is really a grower album. So I can see a time when Nonetheless is my new number 9, and this gets relegated to number 10. But this is what I prefer on this album to Nonetheless. It's the energy that's from the 21st Century albums of the Pet Shop Boys, maybe the most energetic, the most pure pop. Pop Kids, the song Pop Kids is maybe my favorite Pet Shop Boys song, especially like single A-sides, hit songs by Pet Shop Boys of the 21st Century. And the whole album is really a great stomping party record in a way, but also with more depth and I think with a bit more to say than Electric, which is also one of those more recent more up-tempo albums. So Super is a great pop album, later day Pet Shop Boys pop album. And now number 8, and from now on I think we're really talking about brilliant, excellent albums. I would say Nonetheless and Super are very good albums, but now we really now we really reach the upper regions, and all of those next 8 albums are really great and very albums you can listen to over and over again and don't really get boring. This is fundamental. I'm not really that much into pure dance music, really techno and minimal techno and all those styles. I like the Pet Shop Boys because of their pop sensibilities and songwriting, and that they also have this electronic side that's just a side thing for me. But this is their purest, that's them at their most electronic sounding, and as I mentioned before, even minimal techno. So this is sonically maybe one of the most, if not the most radical sounding album, and maybe one of the least commercial sounding albums, where they really tried to be edgy and almost experimental in places, and I really respect it for that. It's also a very dark album, dark subjects, but also the sound is really a hard sound, a dark sound. So it's not really, if you're a Pet Shop Boys fan for all the great pop fanfare and clever wordplay and the hits, this is probably not your album. But if you're more leaning into that real electronic music direction, then this is probably even better than number 8 for you. But it's a strong number 8, and I think we can say this is the first real album classic by Pet Shop Boys on today's list. So from now on, only classics. Although my number 7, that's debatable. I think that's an album that's the opposite to Fundamental. It's their least electronic sounding album. It's their most like a traditional pop rock, or in this case even Brit-pop band sounding album. I think it's their reaction to 90s Brit-pop. It's the first album from the 21st Century. It's 2002's release. So I think some hardcore Pet Shop Boys fans will have this lower because they like their Pet Shop Boys to be very synthetic sounding band. But this is the one album where they really, they always have songs as exceptions, but this is really an album where mostly it's really the band format. Also Johnny Marr plays guitar on many songs, but even Neil plays lots of guitars on that album, and it's so atypical, like Fundamental, but from the other direction, one could say. It's so atypical that I really respect it. like a respect fundamental for them trying new things. But this is more up my alley because I'm really into guitar music mostly. So I was really glad when this came out and the way it sounded. Like I said, lots of long-time hardcore Pet Shop Boys fans maybe were a bit alienated by that album, but I really think the songwriting is great, and in places it sounds like an Oasis album, I would say. And the highlights to me, the first single, I Get Along, that's a great song with Johnny Marr on guitar. But London is also great. Email is like, that there's a version where it's a medley with I Get Along, but here on its own, Email, great song. Yeah, great album. This release called Release. Number 6, and now really now it's really, Fundamental and Release, depending on which perspective you come from, are also classics. Fundamental is for the more electronic leaning Pet Shop Boys fans, a classic, and Release is more for the pop and songwriting oriented fans, a classic. But from now on, there's no debate. The next 6 albums are really, to everyone who's remotely interested in the Pet Shop Boys, classic. And we start off with their, it doesn't really get much more classic as with their debut album, Please. That's the first of all the albums on the list. From now on, all the albums are really packed with classic songs also, not just the singles, but it starts off this great opener, 2 divided by 0, which wasn't a single, but this is, they start their career, their album career, with a song that defines them in 2 to 3 minutes. This song has everything that a great Pet Shop Boys song should have. And the next song, of course, West End Girls, in terms of charts positions, their biggest success ever, which is a bit sad because it's their debut single. They never reached the chart success with any of their subsequent singles to West End Girls, and there's a reason. It's a brilliant track. Next song is also classic, Opportunities, Let's Make Lots of Money. Then my favorite Pet Shop Boys song of all time. I did once a video ranking my top 10 favorite Pet Shop Boys songs, and this was my number 1 song, which is Love Comes Quickly, the second single, which wasn't really that successful in the charts as compared to West End Girls, but in my opinion is their best song. And I was delighted to hear that Noel Gallagher last year, I think, gave an interview where he also said that this is his favorite Pet Shop Boys song. So him and me, we have the same favorite song, and it's a single, but it's not really an ultra hit for casual Pet Shop Boys fans. So this is more almost like a deep cut from the early singles at least, and Love Comes Quickly, perfect songwriting. Next song is also a classic, Suburbia, although I prefer the single and radio edits of that song. The album version, I think, isn't that brilliant, but still, this is a fantastic album, of course. Lots of great songs. Number 5. Number 5. This, many Pet Shop Boys fans will have this probably as their number 1. I think as an album, it's probably their most successful. It's the album that defined the so-called Imperial phase. According to Neil Tennant, the Imperial phase lasted from, like, when this came out in 1987 to 1989, I think it lasted longer to me. If I would define an imperial phase of the Pet Shop Boys, it would be 1986 to 1996, the first 10 years basically. But, I think in Neil's and many fans' estimation, this is the high water mark of the boys, actually. One could say, why is it just number 5 on your list? But as I said, to me, the top 8 albums are all masterpieces in a way, and packed with hits, of course. Rent, What Have I Done to Deserve This, with Dusty Springfield. That was the comeback of Dusty Springfield. Then the title track, it couldn't happen here, the title track to the movie the Pet Shop Boys made in, I think, 1989, which is, actually it's one of my top 10 favorite movies of all time, not just music movies. I prefer it to A Hard Day's Night, for example. I think it's probably the best music movie of all time in the style of something like Hard Day's Night or Help. and it's also a great song. It's a Sin, big #1 hit around the world. Heart, also #1 hit in Britain. King's Cross, which is I think about when they met in King's Cross, Neil and Chris, I think in 1982-83, around that time. I think in a shop where they in an electronic shop, because each of them was looking for, I think, cables for synthesizers, and they met there and talked about their mutual interest in synthesizers and electronic music. So King's Cross is a bit about that. And have I forgotten one of the mega classics on this album? Possibly, but all of the songs are great, and the ones I've mentioned are big classics. Not just Pet Shop Boys classics, but 80s pop classics. Number 4, now this is maybe the most controversial placement on the complete list, next to having actually that low. That's the other album that I see often as the #1 album by fans, which is interesting because it was after the so-called Imperial phase. This was the album when the chart positions, took a hit and went downhill. It's Behavior. I think it's their rubber soul in a way. It's also the first reflective, nostalgic album where they really also, on one hand, blossoming as songwriters, but also maturing. Being Boring to many people is the best, songwriting-wise, the best song they ever wrote, and it's also in my top 10 favorite Pet Shop Boys song. If this is their rubber soul, then Being Boring is there in my life, I would say. And yeah, it's a fantastic album, and this is more than Please and Actually, the 2 albums before. One could say are almost like best of albums. They're like great hits, and this is more an album, although it has great single songs as well, but like Being Boring. But this is really the first time Pet Shop Boys really had an album masterpiece. So that's why it's also, in my opinion, the rubber soul, because this is when they really discovered themselves or reinvented themselves as an album band and as serious songwriters in a way. It's just my number 4. First of all, because the next 3 I prefer, of course, but also maybe because if there's something this album is lacking, which is very important to the Pet Shop Boys, then it's the more lightheartedness, and there's also humorous songs on this album, like How Can You Expect to Be Taken Seriously, which is about, I think, an interview that Neil watched with a one-hit wonder pop group. It's the band that was interviewed was very, very superficial, and you could really see that they were just in it for being pop stars, which the Pet Shop Boys always claimed they were themselves too. But on this album they discovered that they saw themselves also as serious artists and songwriters, and this is the only thing that prevents this album from being higher, that maybe in places it takes itself a bit too serious and is a bit too somber. I want my Pet Shop Boys also to be very bright and colorful, pop-tastic in a way, and that's what the next album is about, being a pop-tastic, very bright album. Even the cover artwork resembles that. It's very, very Pet Shop Boys. I think that was the first album of theirs that I bought, and I bought it around the time it came out, and not this version, which is the further listening, but I bought it around the time when it came out in 1993. It must have been. The videos to Can You Forgive Her and Go West were on non-stop rotation on MTV, and this was the last album where they really were big also on mainstream radio, also in my country, Austria. After that they became more and more something like an acquired taste for, and more something that indie fans would gravitate to. But this was the last time when they were already respected by indie people, but still were a big mainstream pop act and stadium act in a way. The tour to this album was a big stadium and arena tour, and it's not just the big hits like Can You Forgive Her or Go West. It's the complete album is a great. It's the most Eurodance techno sounding album, so the sound it sounds a bit cheap maybe to especially to today's ears, but even back then. But that was with intention, and that's also a bit of that tongue-in-cheekness of the Pet Shop Boys to make it sound that cheap yet bombastic at the same time. But you know, as the melodies, you know, this is the album I think maybe with the best melodies and some of the funniest, wittiest lyrics, like "Dreaming of the Queen," where Neil dreams about the Queen, of course, but also Lady Di and Prince Charles are there, and yeah, it's a great song and a great album. Number two, maybe that's the most surprising thing on my list, but it was also number two on this crappy video I did 3 years ago. So for people who watch that, it's not that surprising. I often see it very low when Pet Shop Boys are getting ranked, but I really love this album. I also this is the second album I bought on the day it came out, and it's bilingual from 1996. This is one of the best summer albums of all time. You know that I usually listen to it in like July, August, and you know it's almost a concept album about, you know, being a tourist in Mediterranean countries, and it's like a music. It's almost like a music. You know, the Pet Shop Boys later on they would do musicals, but this album is like a concept album, like a musical about visiting Mediterranean or even Latin American countries, and it has such a positivity, such a positive, warm, summery vibe. But also the not summery tracks on that album are great, like the ballad "The Survivors," which I think is, according to my top 10 favorite songs of Pet Shop Boys video, my number 2 or 3 favorite Pet Shop Boys song. But single before, I think is one of the best singles ever. Sia Vida A, That's the Way Life Is, the first single, or maybe it was the second single. Great summer song, but also the album tracks, great on this album. And my number 1, I think the Pet Shop Boys themselves would not agree with me there. I think they think, and maybe some of their fans as well, that this is a glorified remix EP, and it's a bit of like a song from here, a song from there. It wasn't really conceived like, for example, Behavior as an album, as a statement, as a piece of art, but it was just some remixes and single A-sides and songs they did for other people, put in one place, and it's just 6 songs, and one could say it's maybe just an EP or mini album, but I don't think it's that. I think it's a proper album, because most of the songs are longer than 6, 7, 8 minutes, so it has the length of a full-length album, and so many things happening on these 6 songs that it really feels like an album, like the experience of a full-length album. It's, of course, it's introspective, maybe the least appropriate title they ever gave to an album, because it doesn't really sound very introspective. It's mostly very long mixes of great, songs from, that's the peak maybe of the so-called imperial phase, with Left to My Own Devices, Domino Dancing, which is one of my favorite of the hits, Always on My Mind, maybe the biggest hit next to Go West, West End Girls, and It's a Sin, and these are those extra long mixes of those songs, plus I'm Not Scared, which they wrote for, I've forgotten the name, I think Eighth Wonder, that's pop group with Patsy Kensit as a singer. So one could say it's a bit of a mix, mishmash of leftovers and extended mixes, but to me this is as a listening experience the one that gives me most joy and most awe. I'm really in awe of that album because of the big production, those mixes. It's not just like, which sometimes remixes tend to be a bit tiresome if you're not really into dancing to them, with very monotonous, but this isn't very monotonous. It's really symphonic, it's like a full possibly 40-piece orchestra and lots of percussion things happening all the time. It's really a wild ride, that album, and yeah, Introspective is my favorite Pet Shop Boys album. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, goodbye.